Winston Churchill did not begin life as a man who would save anything. He began it as a disappointment. He was born on the 30th of November, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, one of the grandest houses in England. The kind of building that announces, simply by existing, that the people inside it matter. His full name was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, a conservative politician of blazing intelligence and almost total self-destruction. A man who rose to Chancellor of the Exchequer and then resigned on a point of principle, discovered that no one came to beg him back, and spent the remaining years of his life watching his influence evaporate. He died at 45 from a degenerative brain disease, a ruined man. His mother was Jenny Jerome, an American socialite from New York, glamorous and ambitious and almost entirely elsewhere. Churchill adored both of them. He barely knew either of them. The person who raised him was his nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Everest, a woman of no social standing and complete devotion whom he called womb and loved without reservation. She was the fixed point of his childhood. When she died in 1895, he was at her bedside. He kept her photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. The schools were less kind. He failed the Harrow entrance exam twice. Teachers described him as slow, troublesome, and difficult to manage. The institution that was supposed to shape him mostly confirmed what his father already suspected, that the boy was not going to amount to much. There was one exception. He was extraordinary at English and history. The teachers recording his failures were doing so in the language he would one day use to change the world. He failed the entrance exam to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst twice as well. On the third attempt he passed. He graduated 8th out of 150 students in cavalry. By the time he left Sandhurst, the pattern of his life was already visible to anyone paying attention. Fail, fail, pass, and then exceed every expectation that had been set for him. What followed was a young man in a very deliberate hurry. He used his mother's social connections, one of the few things she reliably provided, to attach himself to military campaigns where he had no official role and no obligation to be. He observed the Spanish fighting Cuban rebels in 1895 and came home with a lifelong attachment to cigars and afternoon naps. He served on the northwest frontier in India between 1896 and 1898. And while there, in the hours between soldiering, he conducted a furious self-education, reading Gibbon, Macaulay, Plato, Darwin, economics, trying to fill in, through sheer will and volume, the gaps that his formal schooling had left. He participated in one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan. He was present, he was watching, and he was writing about all of it. The Boer War in South Africa made him famous. He went as a war correspondent in 1899, was captured by Boer forces, held as a prisoner of war, and escaped, traveling nearly 300 miles through hostile territory to reach safety. He was 25 years old. By the time he arrived home, his name was in every newspaper in Britain. He had funded the whole adventure, as he would fund most of what followed, through writing. Dispatches, articles, books, the literary ambition was there from the beginning, running alongside the soldiering and the risk-taking, inseparable from both. He was elected to Parliament in 1900. The career was beginning. The catastrophes had not yet arrived. He arrived in Parliament as a conservative riding the fame of the Boer War escape and lasted 4 years before doing something that British political culture treats as roughly equivalent to a cardinal sin. In 1904, Churchill crossed the floor, defected to the Liberal Party over a disagreement on free trade, and in doing so made enemies of the people who had expected to be his natural allies. The Conservatives did not forget. They would not forget for a long time. What followed was, by any measure, a period of genuine achievement that history tends to skip past in its rush toward the disasters. Alongside David Lloyd George, Churchill pushed through real and lasting social reform, labor exchanges that connected the unemployed with work, limits on working hours, early foundations of what would eventually become the welfare state. He was, in these years, a progressive. The man who would later become synonymous with conservatism and empire spent his 30s building the architecture of the modern British state. It is one of the more inconvenient complications of his story. In 1908, he married Clementine Hosier. It was, by every account, the best decision of his life. She was intelligent, principled, and honest with him in ways that almost no one else ever dared to be. She would remain the emotional anchor of his career, the person who steadied him when the storms came, and they came often. In 1921, their daughter Marigold died of septicemia at the age of 2. Churchill grieved in the way he grieved everything, inwardly, and then by moving forward. Some losses he simply carried. By 1911, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, and here, finally, was a role that matched the scale of his ambitions. He modernized the Royal Navy with an urgency that his colleagues found excessive and history would find prescient. He converted the fleet from coal to oil, pushed for faster and more powerful battleships, and created the Royal Naval Air Service. When war was declared in August 1914, the Navy was ready. That readiness was Churchill's work. Then came Gallipoli, and everything collapsed. The idea was his, a naval campaign to force open the Dardanelles Strait, knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war, and potentially shorten the conflict by years. The strategic logic was not without merit. The execution was catastrophic. The naval assault failed. A land invasion followed, grinding on for months in the heat and the blood of the Gallipoli Peninsula. More than 250,000 Allied casualties. The campaign became a symbol of military futility, and Churchill became the man responsible for it. He was forced to resign from the Admiralty and stripped of real power. By some accounts, he was, in those weeks, closer to breaking than at any other point in his life. He did not break. He did something that required a different kind of courage than charging with the cavalry in Sudan. He resigned from government entirely and went to fight on the Western Front as a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He led men through trenches in the winter of 1915 and 16. He came back. The years that followed were a catalogue of controversies and mistakes. He authorized the deployment of the Black and Tans in Ireland, a brutal intervention that left a wound in Anglo-Irish relations that has never fully healed. He advocated for the use of chemical weapons against what he called uncivilized tribes in Iraq and Afghanistan. As Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1925, he returned Britain to the gold standard, triggering deflation, unemployment, and eventually the general strike of 1926. Economists and historians have picked over that decision ever since. The consensus is not kind. He was knocked down, and he kept getting up. What he had not yet learned was the difference between resilience and judgment. That lesson was still coming. By 1929, Churchill was out of government, deeply in debt, and widely regarded as a man whose best years were behind him. He was 54 years old and had already held more offices, survived more catastrophes, and caused more trouble than most politicians manage in an entire career. The establishment had largely made its peace with his absence. He had not made his peace with theirs. He wrote, he painted, he retreated to Chartwell, his house in Kent, and he watched Germany, from 1933 onward, as Adolf Hitler consolidated power and began systematically rearming a nation. The rest of Europe was pretending to keep defanged. Churchill stood in Parliament and said what almost no one else was willing to say. He said that the danger was real, that appeasement was not diplomacy but delay, and that delay was going to cost lives on a scale that the continent had not yet recovered from imagining. He was mocked. He was dismissed. He was called a warmonger, a relic, a man too in love with conflict to be trusted with the analysis of it. The depression he called his black dog was with him through these years. There are accounts of him standing at the edge of the Thames and looking down for too long. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and came home holding a piece of paper, declaring peace for our time. Churchill stood in the House of Commons and delivered his verdict without softening it. Britain and France had been offered a choice between war and dishonor. They had chosen dishonor. They would get war. 6 months later, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. The man the establishment had spent a decade dismissing had been right about all of it. When war came in September 1939, Churchill returned to the Admiralty. The signal went out to the fleet. Winston is back. On the 10th of May 1940, with Chamberlain's government collapsing in the wreckage of a failed campaign in Norway, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. He was 65 years old. That same morning, Hitler launched his invasion of France and the Low Countries. There was no settling in period. There was no grace. His first speech to Parliament as Prime Minister offered nothing comfortable. Blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He meant it. What followed in the next 6 weeks was the closest Britain came to losing everything. France fell. 338,000 Allied troops were pulled off the beaches of Dunkirk in an improvised, miraculous evacuation that Churchill was careful not to let anyone mistake for a victory. And then, in the last days of May, inside the War Cabinet, came the moment that the entire preceding decade had been moving toward. Lord Halifax argued for a negotiated peace with Hitler, brokered through Mussolini. It was not an unreasonable position by any conventional measure. Churchill refused. Absolutely, finally, and without room for further discussion. If this Long Island story of ours was to end, he told his cabinet, let it end only when each one of them lay choking in their own blood upon the ground. It did not end. The RAF held through the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe turned back. The invasion never came. Churchill's speeches moved through the darkness like torches. We shall fight on the beaches, never in the field of human conflict, and people held on. Then came the shadow. In 1943, a famine in Bengal killed an estimated 2 to 3 million people. Churchill's government diverted food supplies. He made remarks about Indians that had no defense then and have none now. It sits inside the same story as the heroism because it is part of the same man. Pearl Harbor brought America into the war in December 1941. Churchill, by his own account, slept the sleep of the saved. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered. He stood before the crowds and told them it was their victory. They roared back that it was his. Both things were true. 3 months after victory in Europe, the British public voted Winston Churchill out of office. Not narrowly, in a landslide. He received the news at Potsdam, mid-negotiation with Stalin and Truman, in the middle of shaping the post-war world. He flew home to a country that had decided it was finished with him. Clementine suggested it might be a blessing in disguise. Churchill replied that it appeared to be very effectively disguised. It is tempting to read the 1945 election as an act of ingratitude, and Churchill felt it that way, at least at first. But the country was not wrong. It had made a clear-eyed calculation that the man who had won the war was not the man to build what came after it. The public trusted Labour on housing, on health, on employment, on the shape of a peacetime Britain that the Conservatives had not convincingly imagined. They were right about that too. Clement Attlee built the National Health Service. Churchill had saved the country those institutions would be built inside. Both things were necessary. Only one of them was his. He did not disappear. He was constitutionally incapable of disappearing. In March 1946, standing in Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman seated behind him, Churchill delivered a speech that named the world most people were still struggling to describe. An iron curtain, he said, had descended across Europe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, the continent had been divided, and the Soviet Union was the force that had drawn the line. The Cold War had been underway for months. Churchill was simply the first person with the platform and the language to say so out loud. The speech alarmed people. It was supposed to. He spent the years of opposition writing. The 6-volume history of the Second World War that he produced during this period is a monument of English prose and an act of breathtaking self-mythologization in equal measure. He had said during the war that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it. He was not entirely joking. In 1953, the Nobel Committee awarded him the prize in literature. He remains the only British Prime Minister to have won it. In 1951, he returned as Prime Minister, age 76. It was a remarkable thing, and also, by most accounts, a term that lasted longer than it should have. 2 years in, he suffered a serious stroke that was kept from the public entirely while he remained in office. The machinery of government quietly arranged around a man who was no longer fully capable of running it. He resigned in April 1955, handing over to Anthony Eden, and retired to Chartwell. The last decade of his life was a long, slow quieting. He painted. He received visitors. He sat in the house he had loved for 40 years and grew old in it. The speeches were over, The decisions were over. What remained was the man himself, stripped of the office that had defined him, still present but receding. On the 15th of January 1965, he suffered a severe stroke. 9 days later, on the 24th of January, Winston Churchill died at his home in London. He was 90 years old. His state funeral drew leaders from across the world. His coffin was placed on a barge and carried up the Thames through the heart of the city he had refused to abandon during the Blitz. As it passed, the dock workers along the riverbank dipped their crane jibs in salute. One by one, in silence, the great arms lowered. It was, for a man who had spent his life reaching for the right gesture at the right moment, exactly the right farewell. Winston Churchill tops every poll as the greatest Briton who ever lived, and the case is genuine. He also defended an empire that caused real suffering and held convictions that were a moral failure by any honest measure. Both things are true, and they belong in the same sentence. He was not a simple man, and he does not deserve a simple verdict. What he deserves is the one he essentially wrote for himself, that when liberal democracy faced its darkest hour, he was the one who refused to let it end. Please subscribe so I can keep making videos like these.